Yes, what an interesting interaction. Wait, Well, hello there folks, this is Lige, and welcome to my first video about Monster Hunter Wilds that I am making now having actually played the game. At this time, the open beta for Wilds has concluded its play period, and hopefully a bunch of you were able to experience the gameplay for yourselves. I personally jumped in on PS5, getting in on the early access, which allowed me to basically play for a whole week. During this time, I logged about 20 hours in the beta, most of which was spent messing around and having a good time. I have to say, this game is feeling great to play. The new combat mechanics are super fun, and there are so many systems that will be game-changing for quality of life in the full release. But after having my fun, I figured I should probably get a video put together covering some of the brand new content that we were able to experience thanks to the beta. So I'm sure the hottest topic about the beta for most people were the many changes to the different weapon types. Because of course, every single weapon in Wilds has now received new attacks, different combo options, and in some cases, complete overhauls to their identities. And I certainly spent no shortage of time experimenting with each weapon to learn their new flows. But as much as I would like to break down each weapon's changes in detail, that unfortunately is not what this video will be about. I just don't think that the limited time I had with the beta would be best spent making the 50th guide on how to master the new gun lance. Oh yeah, right, I should probably introduce what this video is actually about since you already would have read the title and all. In the interest of having a video that is hopefully a bit different from what we've been seeing coming out of the beta so far, I have decided to take on the rather mundane sounding task of documenting the wildlife of the Monster Hunter Wilds beta. But this won't be simply listing all the creatures that you can encounter in the map. Instead, I have put in the time to properly observe and record as many different behaviors and interactions between the wildlife that I could find. What this consisted of was me just standing around and getting footage of each species of monster going about their business. The goal being to see what kind of routines they would follow and also to observe the interactions that they have with other monsters. As you would expect, I did this for each large monster featured in the beta, but I also tried to get plenty of footage for each small monster too. And finally, even though their behaviors will be a lot simpler, I tried to record as many species of endemic life that I could as well. Now if you are thinking that this all sounds pretty boring, well, you might be right. But I also hope that some of you might find an appreciation for the attention to detail that has gone into making the game world feel like an actual ecosystem. There has always been a lot of these types of details in Monster Hunter games, and especially starting with World, I feel like that the devs' vision of a living world became a lot closer to being realized. In the case of Wilds, we knew from the get-go that this would be even more of a focus, so going into the beta, I knew that I would want to be paying close attention to the nuances in monster behaviors. So without further ado, I will be diving into my observations now. To keep things organized, I will first be covering the large monsters of the beta, whom you may have gotten to know pretty well by now. Then we will jump to the small monsters that mostly stay in the background, but have interesting nuances of their own as well. And finally, I will cover all of the endemic life that I was able to capture with my net or fish up. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some that I missed though, so let me know if you found any additional creatures. Starting with the large monsters, we have the first monster that we are tasked with hunting in the beta, the Chatacabra. This frog-like fellow seems to be tasked with being the game's tutorial monster, and as such, is a bit of a pushover in combat. It's got some interesting mechanics though, such as using its saliva to stick rocks to its arms in order to strengthen them. For my observations, however, I was more curious about how this fellow lives its life, so I recorded a bunch of footage of the monster out of combat. Yep, there he is. Look at him go. Ooh, what are you doing? Sorry, getting sidetracked. Aha, there we go. So we actually were able to observe the Chatacabra lick up the ground a bit. This actually produces a track for us, which we can collect for research. As a little bit of an aside to discuss general game mechanics, it does seem that the tracks mechanic from World has partially returned to Wilds. The main difference is that it doesn't seem that these tracks are the primary method of locating monsters, as our Secret is stated to be able to recognize monsters by scent. Instead, the tracks monsters drop are a lot more infrequent, but they do seem to always provide us with monster materials. So just like we've seen with Chatacabra here, I think each large monster should have at least one idle behavior that results in these types of tracks being dropped. Back to our observations, I did end up being spotted by the Chatacabra and it did aggro to me pretty quickly. I was wondering if large monsters would behave somewhat like in World where some were passive until attacked, but it does seem that every monster in this beta would attack if you remained in their sight for too long. While I was running from Chatacabra, I did notice a nearby Doshaguma, so I decided to let them go at it for a bit. Let's talk about large monster turf wars real quick. When we watch this scuffle between Doshaguma and Chatacabra, we don't have a scripted turf war animation. Instead, the Doshaguma ends up wailing on the Chatacabra with some of its basic attacks. We can see decent damage numbers for these hits, and they also stagger it pretty easily. This is a bit different from how monsters fought in past games. While monsters could actively attack each other before, the damage they would do seemed to be quite little, and they would almost never be able to knock each other over. Now in World, we had the turf wars that would deal a larger chunk of damage, and in Rise, we also had the Wyvern Ride mechanic where two monsters clashing would likely make one of them rideable. However, if you ever ended up with multiple monsters in the same area and these mechanics didn't trigger, then you would be stuck with two monsters that are more interested in fighting you than each other. What I've noticed in Wilds, however, is that when any monsters are in close proximity, they will actively fight using normal attacks, and these attacks can easily result in knockdowns. And finally, when one monster has been knocked around enough, it will flee on its own, no dung pod required. And this feels almost like a more natural way to handle turf wars because you can have the monsters fight using their normal movesets, and a bespoke animation won't need to be made for every combination of monsters that can encounter each other. That's not to say that I don't like a good turf war animation though, some of them are quite awesome to see. And so rest assured, there are still bespoke turf wars in Wilds. There is at least one that we can observe in this beta, coming up later, and in some of the trailers, we've seen a few more unique ones. Anyways, that should wrap up what I wanted to talk about regarding general mechanics, so I should hopefully be able to keep the rest of this video to going through all of my observations. To continue with Chatacabra here, honestly, a lot of my footage of the monster out of combat was just of it idly looking around and slowly moving between locations. And this is kinda about what we should have expected anyways. It's not as if these monsters have to be doing activities at all times. But that's not to say that this frog doesn't know how to kick back from time to time. Turns out, a hotspot for Chatacabras is the lovely oasis located in the middle of the sand dunes area. I would suppose that as amphibians, these fellows would like to stay nice and hydrated. To finish up, I have to say that I unfortunately didn't catch any footage of the Chatacabra eating. Since this has been a standard monster behavior for most games, I would assume that Chatacabra has a designated food source, but I only had a limited time to record footage, so unfortunately this video won't be comprehensive for every action monsters will have. Listen, okay, I may have had this video idea before jumping into the beta, but I also may have put off doing my recording until the second to last day, so, whoops. Moving on to the next large monster featured in the beta, we have Doshaguma. After the Chatacabra, most players probably fought this one, as there is a fixed quest to take down an alpha that is guaranteed to spawn in the map. And so, this is our first introduction to a large monster that has pack behavior. Although the Alpha Doshaguma is stronger than the others, players will quickly learn that the additional Doshaguma aren't just set dressing, and will quite quickly become a problem if you try to fight them all at once. And this is why the game prompts us to use a large dung pod in order to scatter the pack so the Alpha can be fought alone. Now, after the scripted quest against the Alpha, we might find individual Doshaguma scattered across the map, and any one of them can be fought for a full-length hunt. So the first thing I was interested in was, how do packs of Doshaguma end up forming like they did for the first quest? And the answer isn't actually all that exciting. As it turns out, the Doshaguma you see around the map will behave independently and will enter and leave the area on their own schedules. However, when an Alpha Doshaguma shows up, it will bring its own squad with it. And it seems that the pack members that appear with the Alpha will generally try to stay together unless we go and separate them. You may have noticed a message when attacking one of the Alpha's pack members that says a quest cannot be created for that particular target. And this seems to be because these pack members are linked to the Alpha. But if you found a Doshaguma outside the Alpha's pack, you could start a quest for it like normal. Anyways, for my observations, I wanted to go ahead and find an alpha Doshaguma so I could see their idle behaviors while in a pack. Turns out, by the way, that after the first quest, alphas are pretty rare to spawn, so I was waiting around quite a while before I found one. I was actually fortunate enough to find the exact spot where the Doshagumas entered the map, so we can see them arrive from outside the area. This alpha had a pack with 2 other Doshaguma, but I did later spot one that had 3 extras in its pack, so the pack size can vary. And now, to sit around and watch these fellas do their thing. A general observation that I noticed when watching this pack for a while is that they seem to move in a formation. We can see one Doshaguma traveling in front of the alpha while the other brings up the rear. And I'm pretty sure that the other Doshaguma choose their positions relative to the alpha, as I noticed multiple times where the alpha was in the front, so one of the others quickly speeds up to get in front of it. As my timing would have it, this pack spawned right at the start of a sand tide event, but this didn't actually seem to change their behaviors. A funny event that I managed to capture quite early here is the Doshaguma being struck by lightning. And right after this happens, the pack begins to go on alert. A bit of a weird response, as I don't think lightning is the kind of thing you can simply look around for to see if it's coming. That said, we do see the same response in other cases when the pack is attacked, so it makes sense that this is just what they do. Skipping ahead, as the Doshaguma are traveling along their routes, the alpha suddenly aggroes, and it is not on the Ceratonoth just in front of it, but it turns out that it spotted my pop-up camp. I guess it was just utterly compelled to make a beeline for it and tear it down. A little bit rude if you'd ask me. After that business was taken care of, the Doshaguma have arrived at their main nest location. I suppose they've deserved a little rest after a hard day's work. You know, they almost look cute when sleeping. Almost. It feels like there's a lot of neat little details in these animations, like how one Doshaguma wakes up first and starts sniffing and looking around. Meanwhile, the alpha wakes up and just sets off without paying any mind to the pack members, and even does a little yawn and shake on the way out. And the last Doshaguma to wake up is kinda like, oh crap, I need to catch up, and it runs ahead getting in front of the alpha, which is seemingly its spot in the pack formation. Here's a nice little detail, these monsters, just like any living thing, will get thirsty. We can see each member of the pack stop at the river to grab a drink. And I didn't get a great look at it, but we can even see the alpha seemingly washing itself off. For our next exciting event, the pack gathers under a tree for a little sit down. Well, isn't that nice? And it also seems that my Scoutflies are detecting a fresh new track to investigate. Oh, well, I mean, that's, useful, I guess. So the last thing I wanted to record for the Doshaguma specifically was them eating. Unfortunately, similar to Chatacabra, I didn't catch any footage of them doing that. I am realizing after the fact that perhaps I would have been more likely to catch some eating behaviors if I engaged in combat to actively exhaust the monsters, but oh well. However, a behavior that I was well aware of was the Doshaguma's interaction with smaller monsters. This is one that many of you have probably experienced as well. When we are in combat with a Doshaguma, if small monsters are nearby, then the Doshaguma don't necessarily see them as a food source, but a weapon. So I decided to aggro this pack, and quite easily I was able to find a small monster herd and show this off. Turns out that giving 3 of these guys access to ammunition is quite dangerous. Make sure to watch out for incoming projectiles from all directions. And I said that I didn't catch any footage of the Doshaguma eating, but I actually got pretty close. After fighting the alpha for a while, it randomly de-aggroed me to grab a piece of prey in its mouth and just started dragging it away. I would assume that after a while it would stop and eat it, but instead I think the alpha heard a nearby Chatacabra talking smack because when I wasn't looking, it dropped its meal and ran off to start a fight with it. Oh wow, you go Chatacabra. Welcome to the point in the video where I realized that I vastly underestimated how much content I would be covering in one video. We still have 2 large monsters to cover, plus all the small ones and Endemic Life. Looks like this is going to be a bit of a long one, but I'll see if I can pick up the pace a bit. Our next monster to observe will be the Balahara, which is the sandworm type monster we encountered in the opening sequence. Now from the intro, I kinda assumed that the Balahara would operate in packs like the Doshaguma. However, during the beta gameplay, we will usually only see Balahara roaming individually. Perhaps the full game will include packs of them, but I haven't seen any so far. For my observations, I have to say that this was one of the less interesting monsters in terms of unique behaviors. For the most part, the Balahara I was watching sorta just stood around and swam through the sand when changing areas. That's not to say there was nothing though. At one point, the Balahara partially buries itself in the sand and assumes this weird pose where it goes completely still. But it only does it for a moment, so I'm not quite sure what its goal was. And for our obligatory research sample, the Balahara spits up a bit of its mucus, which gives us our thing to collect. Aha, now here's the moment you have all been waiting for. After a Doshaguma shows up, these two monsters engage in a proper turf war. And this is pretty interesting. We will notice how the Balahara was alone all this time, but the moment the fight starts, two more emerge from the sand and throw themselves at the Doshaguma. Even with the help though, the extra two are quickly thrown off and disappear just as quickly as they appeared. The one that remains doesn't fare much better, as the Doshaguma seems to be able to rather brutally wrench its jaw open before tossing it aside. So I guess Balahara isn't that great of a matchup with Doshaguma in direct combat. It's weird, however, that the two extra Balaharas were summoned for this specific moment only to be basically useless. But this does actually conclude most of the footage that I grabbed for Balahara. I am sad, however, that I didn't get one of the monster's signature features recorded, which would be the Balahara's sinkhole ability. This is one that you have definitely seen yourself though, as it was featured in the opening sequence. In normal gameplay, however, this can happen randomly and both you and other monsters can fall into it. I know this was shown off in some of the gameplay showcases as a method to separate packs of monsters, and it is honestly just really cool. And with that, we will move on to the final large monster of the beta, the apex of the Windward Plains, Rey Dau. In the context of the beta, this guy served as an extra challenge for those who wished to test their mastery of the new combat mechanics. Personally, I found this fight to be super fun. That is, aside from the times where I found myself caught in front of Rey Dau's railgun. But let's see how this monster spends some of its downtime, shall we? So during normal conditions, Rey Dau isn't always present on the map. This is of course because Rey Dau's preferred weather is the Windward Plains Sand Tide event. From my experience, if Rey Dau isn't around, it will usually be arriving shortly after the Sand Tide begins. When it isn't out and about, Rey Dau can often be found in this upper area of the plains, which I suppose is like a nice perch from which to survey the area. Here we are treated to some nice idle animations. With a little scratching of the ground, Rey Dau can provide us a nice research track. And a neat detail that we can often observe is that Rey Dau is periodically being struck by lightning. Unlike other monsters where this will hurt and stagger them, Rey Dau doesn't even flinch, and in fact, the lightning seems to be absorbed into its body. This could be the lore explanation for how Rey Dau builds up the electricity in its body. Other than that, it's just kinda nice to watch Rey Dau just chillin' out. Oh, big yawn. Of course, when Rey Dau isn't up in its perch, it'll roam the map doing the rounds across its territory. When I caught up to the one I was observing here, it had already started some beef with a Balahara. Seems the Balahara had already been taught a lesson, so it left almost immediately. Uh-oh, looks like it's my turn now. Oh, that was a close one. Surely I should be safe in this cave. Or not, I guess. Or actually, yes, I guess he doesn't like it down here. Anyways, back to observing. Oh, come on! Thirsty boy. Jumping back to the discussion about monster turf wars from earlier, I've noticed that Rey Dau doesn't have any unique animations for them, but it does have a pretty consistent behavior. When Rey Dau encounters another monster, it seems that without fail, after exchanging a few blows, Rey Dau will unleash its full power railgun and put its adversary in their place. This seems to almost always be a guaranteed knockdown, and while I didn't see the number in this clip, I have seen it deal over 1000 damage. What this means is that when Rey Dau is on the map, it can be used as a consistent way to deal a ton of damage to any other monster if you are able to lure it nearby. Pretty handy. For a few more observations, even after the storm clears, Rey Dau does hang around a bit longer. I managed to catch another unique animation where Rey Dau seems to scrape some material off of its wing talon things. Judging from the sorta crystalline look of these parts, I wonder if all the electricity exposure causes fulgurite to grow on itself, which it was cleaning off at this point. Because another thing that we know is that Rey Dau's railgun attack can sorta crystallize the sand into fulgurite deposits, and we also see this material branching out all over the map, probably due to the constant lightning strikes. After doing some more patrolling and getting into another fight, Rey Dau heads off to what I would assume to be its nest. This is an area directly under the giant ring structure, and it is constantly charged with electricity, so I'm sure it's nice and comfy to Rey Dau. And of course, that means it's time for a nice sleep. Once it's awake again, Rey Dau is close to the end of its scheduled time, so it takes flight and leaves the map completely. Unfortunately, I was once again unable to record this guy eating, even though I followed it for long enough that it became hungry on its own. I did actually spot one eating though. Early on in my playtime, I did see it swoop down and grab one of the prey monsters in the plains area. So that should wrap up my Rey Dau observations, and with that, we are done with the large monsters of the beta. Coming up, I will now be documenting all of the small monsters present in the beta. And this might actually be the more compelling part of the video, as I wouldn't be surprised if most people didn't pay much attention to these small monsters. Because who would spend valuable beta time on something as useless as staring at small animals? Oh, right. The most abundant small monster inhabiting the Windward Plains by far is the herbivore species known as the Ceratonoth. Or, I think based on this line read,
I've never heard of a Ceratonoth herd this big before.
I should be saying Ceratonoth. These small monsters can be found in very large herds, and I'm not exaggerating, just look at this. Having this many detailed individual creatures present at the same time feels to me like a pretty big advancement for this series, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of technical resources went into making this possible. Now, the first feature that we'll notice about the Ceratonoth is that a few individuals have large spikes on their backs. The game confirms that these particular individuals are the males of the species, while the more common smooth ones are the females. To start with my observations, I found a medium-sized herd on the move, and the first thing to notice is that the males get on their hind legs and seem to call out to the rest of the herd. I was wondering what was going on until I realized that a Doshaguma was approaching from the opposite direction. I think it would be safe to say that this was their method of warning the herd that danger was imminent, and shortly after, the herd turns around and starts to flee. Well, actually, okay, these fellows here seem to be a bit slow on the uptake, instead running towards Doshaguma before turning around once they were right on top of it. After retreating, the herd has sorta just formed a pile, and everyone is kinda just freaking out while the Doshaguma continues to go about its business. Oh, hold on, I guess the Doshaguma was interested after all, as it suddenly runs in and just grabs a Ceratonoth for the road. You know, I feel like the herd could have done something other than stand around panicking while this happened, but I guess prey animals gotta be prey somehow. Only after Doshaguma has made off with its catch is the herd finally like, oh, we should actually get out of here. While I was focusing on the Doshaguma, it appears that the males of the herd have run off on their own, and a lot of the remaining females seem to be rather confused. So much for herd unity, I guess. It does seem though that eventually, most of the females find their way to a male, and it turns out that there is a good reason for this. While I was watching them group up again, I did notice a detail, which is that the two different males I was observing had different spike configurations, which I just thought was neat. At this point, the groups I am observing are still kinda scattered. In fact, some individuals have just gone to sleep by themselves since it is nighttime after all. However, at a certain point, a lot of the group suddenly moves into the same area, and we can see the male get on its hind legs to yell at everybody again. Or at least I think that was what happened, if only I kept my camera on it. And we can see this behavior both in this group as well as the one in the distance. Although I like this one individual who's just continuing to sleep without a care in the world. I'm sure we've all been there. As you have probably gathered, the reason for all this unrest is the approaching sand tide. From our experiences so far, we know that the biggest threat of the sand tide is the extreme density of lightning strikes. Fortunately, the Ceratonoth seem to be one of the few species living here that have a way of dealing with them. For the individuals that have not gathered around a male, there is a danger of them being struck randomly. But when a male is in the vicinity, we can quite clearly see that those spikes on its back function as a lightning rod. And so, all the females can sleep soundly while the male soaks up all the lightning. I honestly kinda feel bad for this guy, because every time he gets struck, he looks kinda annoyed, like he's thinking, not again, because we can actually see that right when the storm was starting, he was sleeping, but I bet being struck by lightning multiple times is just not something you can sleep through, so he kinda just has to pull an all-nighter to deal with this. Well, hang in there, buddy, at least you got it better than some of the other wildlife. During this storm, I decided to see how one of the other local species deals with lightning strikes. And this species, which resembles a buffalo crossed with a sort of brute wyvern, is known as Dalthydon. Oh no. If there's one thing I've learned from observing the Dalthydon is that they don't seem to have very much self-preservation. In general, these are really just another species of herbivore to serve as food for the other monsters. The Dalthydon can also be seen in small herds, but the group sizes are much smaller than those of the Ceratonoth. And here is a baby one, very small. According to the in-game description, this monster will use its hard head plate to defend itself if attacked. When I went and provoked them, instead of immediately charging me, they behaved quite defensively. The only time one actually hit me was to knock me aside before fleeing, which honestly seems like a pretty smart choice. Now, while this might be stretching the definition of wildlife observations, I wanted to give a bit of time to talk about the village Kunafa, located in the center of the map. If you took the time to explore here, then you would know that the villagers have managed to domesticate the Dalthydon. We can see one here that is being sheared for its fur, but more importantly, given their similarity to cattle, there is one unique product that the villagers can get from these. Oh, thank you. Yummy! And to just shout out our beloved bird friend, Secret, we know from the story that these villagers domesticated them as well, and this is where you can see them being raised. Baby. Let's see, our next small monster to observe will be these crocodile-looking ones. The official name for these is Gajios. Categorically, I believe the game classifies these as leviathans, but they mostly resemble crocodiles/alligators. Their most striking feature, however, is their prominent horns, which sorta look like those of a sawfish. The favorite activity of these guys seems to be lurking in shallow water, waiting for some oblivious prey to walk by. This one in particular seems to be having a really good day. Happy spins! Now unfortunately, the game has given this monster one particular purpose that does not benefit their well-being. With a press of a button, our hunter can tear a chunk of a Gajios' horn right off and convert it into some slinger ammo. Imagine just minding your own business and someone rips your horn off and then fires it back at you out of a slingshot. Who would do such a thing? Our next small carnivore to observe is this species known as Talioth. This is a raptor-like species which I think would put them in the bird-wyvern category. When we look at them closely, we will notice their horrifyingly toothy jaws, which I imagine are quite useful for latching onto prey. On occasion, I have seen single Talioths take down herbivore monsters, but the true strength of these guys comes when they are in a group. If there are enough Talioths present, then they will be emboldened to even attack large monsters. They will do so by jumping at them and latching on with their jaws. With this Chatacabra, 3 Talioths were able to jump on and harass it for a good bit of time before it was able to shake them off. In gameplay, this is pretty useful, as the monster is quite vulnerable while dealing with the Talioths. And it doesn't even stop with just being a distraction. In this scenario, I brought a Doshaguma into a pack of 4 Talioths, and altogether, this group was able to completely knock it down. Thanks, buddies. Even the apex of the plains isn't immune to these guys' antics. In fact, because of the Talioth's small size, Rey Dau's preferred method of dealing with adversaries ends up having some unintended consequences. Alright, well, second time's the charm, I guess. Turns out though that one Talioth is still kicking and it annoys Rey Dau a bit further, causing it to shoot the sky in frustration. And this guy will be heading home after a successful day of being a menace. Next up, we will take a quick look at the flying wing drake type monster known as the Baunos. This is another monster with one primary gameplay purpose. Everyone will have done this at least once during the intro, but if we aim our slinger at them, then we can shoot our hook and somehow rip a screamer pod right out of them. And these remind me of the wing drake type monsters from World known as Noyos, which when hit would produce a screamer pod effect. The difference of course being that once we have the screamer pods from the Baunos, we can use them whenever we like. And other than that, I have to say that after watching the Baunos for a while, they don't really seem to do anything that interesting. Compared to some wing drake species, the Baunos are completely passive and do not attack anything. I was curious if they were perhaps scavengers and ate the carcasses of other monsters, but even when killing some things in the vicinity, they didn't seem that interested. So I think that's really all these guys have going on. One last detail that is worth noting, however, is the unique sound that they produce. Once you learn what they sound like, it's pretty easy to tell when they are nearby, which I think can be pretty useful in gameplay in case you want to snag a quick screamer pod from one mid-combat. And we are now onto the final small monster present in the beta. At least I think this covers all of them. If any slipped under my radar, feel free to let me know in the comments. This monster is an insect species, which I think the game would classify either as a Neopteron or maybe even a Temnoceron, depending on how spider-like it is considered. I say this because you may have seen this monster doing the rounds online for being the subject of a rather amusing arachnophobia setting that is available in the game. Because of course if you've seen the clips, the setting will replace the monster's model with an amorphous slime, which to some people may be more unsettling than their original model. That said, I think it's still nice to have the option of the setting for the people who actually need it. Although I am curious what this setting will do for our confirmed large spider monster that will be in the full game. I could imagine a large monster being pretty difficult to fight in blob form, but I also think that the setting only mentioned affecting small monsters. Then again, I could be misremembering, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. Personally, I think Lalabruna looks kinda cute actually, but anyways, back on topic, let's talk about this bug monster. The proper name for this bug species looks kinda hard to pronounce. I'm gonna go for Bulaqchi. Design-wise, they kinda look like a mix between a spider and maybe a wasp or a mosquito. It looks like they've got some praying mantis arms there too, and it looks like I'm actually counting 6 limbs, so I guess not a spider at all. Still pretty unsettling to look at though. Even though they are much smaller, we can actually observe a couple of these taking down a Ceratonoth. Once it is felled, a couple more individuals arrive to start eating. And in proper mosquito fashion, we can observe them slurping away at the body with a sort of proboscis. If we look closely, we can see that this proboscis unfolds when they need it. Also in combat, they will try to stab me with it. Another behavior that we can observe with the Bulaqchi is them climbing rocks in their area. We can often see them just hanging out in the rocks above, but occasionally they will drop off them as we run under, which could be a sorta ambush tactic. Now for the combat behaviors of the Bulaqchi, thankfully they don't seem to be that much of a threat. We can draw some parallels between the Bulaqchi and previous wasp-like monsters such as the Banabra and the Vespoid. In comparison though, the Bulaqchi do not randomly paralyze you, which makes them significantly less of a problem in my book. In fact, I have to try pretty hard to get them to even attack me, and once they do, their attacks aren't much of a problem. Most of the time, they will just poke with their proboscis, which is very easy to avoid, and even if it hits you, it does barely any damage. The main thing to watch out for is their leap attack, which I had to try very hard to actually have hit me. When it does, however, you will actually be pinned, and I assume that the monster will start trying to drain your blood. I say I assume because the one time it happens, my cat rescued me instantly. So as long as you keep an eye on these monsters, you'll probably have few issues with them. But with that, we have now completed our observations of the small monsters of the beta. And this does leave one more category of wildlife to document, and that will be the endemic life. And this basically includes any wild animals that are not classified as small or large monsters. And the beta was generous enough to provide us with a very important item. We have a capture net. This item works exactly as it did in Monster Hunter World, which allows us to snag any species of endemic life that we come across. I can only assume that this item's presence will also mean that we will have a usage for any captured animals, hopefully being able to display them as pets in some capacity. So from this point onward, I will show off every species of animal that I was able to put in my net. We will have a lot more species to cover than the large and small monsters combined, but hopefully this part of the video will be more rapid fire, as most endemic life will have rather simple behaviors in comparison. Now as I get started here, I do have to apologize for some missing details in my coverage of the endemic life, because as it turns out, the first time you capture an endemic life species, the game would provide a little text description detailing some of the species' ecology. Unfortunately, I caught a bunch of these for the first time when not recording, and I do not remember what most of this text said. I will assume that in the full game, we will have a detailed hunter's notes with the info for each species, but I could not seem to find anything like that in the beta. And there was one thing that I could have done. I could have made a new character in the beta to reset all of the text pop-ups, but I never got around to doing that. So I'll have to wait till the full game to learn more, but in the meantime, hopefully we can just admire all these little creatures. Then in no particular order, let's just run through some little guys. The most little of little guys that we can find are these tiny raptor-like creatures known as Windrustlers. They are small and tiny and run around in packs. Seems like that they like to hang around herbivores and scavenge little bits of food on the ground. When approached, they do seem to flee, but with a ghillie mantle, I can look at them up close. As I was observing them, I was going to note that they seem to have slightly different colorations. That is until I actually saw them side by side and realized that one was quite obviously a variant. So if you're lucky, you can find a black Windrustler, which is stated to be a rare variant with a larger frame. I just want to keep all of these as pets. A creature that you can spot pretty easily from the base camp is the Landlight Shrimp. Sorry, this is one that I missed the pop-up for, so I don't really know if it does anything cool. It's just a blue shrimp guy that hangs out on the rocks. Moving on, I guess. Another species that I missed the pop-up for, but has an easy-to-infer behavior, is the Pallbug. These bugs will show up pretty consistently anytime a monster is killed in the field. They just burrow up from the ground and will slowly crawl toward the carcass and start feeding on it. So just a classic scavenger that assists in returning those who have died back to the earth.
Flesh rots, carrion feeds the scavengers, and the bones remain. All part of the cycle of life.
What she said. Let's look at another cutie. Here we have a tiny bird-like creature that is not a baby Puke, although I'm sure it will still be that in many people's hearts. This species is called Amstrigian, and as it turns out, it's got some babies of its own. Well, I was hoping to scoop up the babies too, but I accidentally did the worst thing ever. Well, these can be pretty hard to spot in the tall grass, but during the fallow, I could see these grasshoppers much easier. This species is returning from world, the Emperor Hopper. Now, a good chunk of endemic life can be interacted with directly on the field for various benefits. Because of this, people don't usually bother to capture them with the net, but it is still possible if you want them for your collection. We have the classic Vigorwasp returning from world, which is an instant heal when their bubbles are popped. There are also the giant variants, which produce a longer lasting healing cloud. I also managed to record the pop-up text for the giant one, which gave me the additional insight that they will show up during the plenty period. Good to know. Also during the plenty, we can find hovering wedge beetles. These were present in world, but only ever fixed to certain spots. These can be grappled to pull ourselves into the air. These hovering ones can be swung from once before they fly away. And unlike in world, they can be captured in our net. There do, however, still exist fixed wedge beetles in certain parts of the map, and these ones cannot be captured, probably because they are needed to access certain areas. And here's a couple more of our classic favorites. Flashflies, working as usual. Paratoad, our beloved, same deal, although now with added mobility. Look at him go. And the delicious Wiggly Litchi, a favored snack for users of the dual blades, bow, or anything that takes a ton of stamina. What's new is that these are actually capturable in the net in wilds, so add them to the list. That's not all of the helper critters though. Wilds has added a few more brand new ones. The Vigormantle Bug is yet another living health potion. These ones, however, latch onto walls and can be picked up from a distance with your hook slinger. Looking at one closely, we can actually see its face, and it's kinda cute looking. Which makes me feel kinda bad because when we use them to heal, it appears we literally grab and squeeze all the juices out of them. And we also have the Great Thunderbug. Technically these aren't new because they have existed in the form of a small monster. However, they are now relegated to the Endemic Life classification. When we encounter them, which is more likely during storms, we can interact with them to activate them. Once activated, they will function as a shock trap if a large monster runs into them. Now you would think it would be a waste to capture one of these, but when I grabbed one in my net, I actually was awarded with a free shock trap. So I guess it's like I just took one to go. And here's one more endemic life that can be useful in battle. Sometimes at night, you can find these bugs that are known as dark hornets. Kinda like bees with headlights, a pretty interesting design. Now if they spot you, they will actually attack you, and if you are stung, you will be poisoned. Despite this, you can still capture them in the net, or you can just hit them to kill them. But what's actually useful about these guys is that if a large monster gets near them, then they will attack and poison it instead. I just happened to observe my Alpha Doshaguma pack from earlier come across some dark hornets, and they really caused a bunch of chaos. In addition to poisoning a large monster, they will also serve as a nice distraction as the monster will fight back to try to swat them down. Now in your travels across the map, you may have come across a few suitable locations to build pop-up camps. Maybe your hunter or one of your companions pointed one of the locations out, but you may have also heard a line about some particular butterflies. Because the location that is suitable for your camp might happen to have a group of butterflies hanging around nearby. And if you throw your net at them, you will pick up some quatreflies. Caterflies maybe? I'm pretty sure that the pop-up message had some important info about these, but I'm afraid I missed recording it again. But I am pretty sure that these simply serve as a marker for your camp locations. I think it's about time to travel across the map to the sand dunes area because there are a few more critters to find. Walking across the desert, we can spot these cute lizards known as Tracktail Lizards. According to the description, these will often be traveling in pairs. From a distance, I originally thought that these were mammals, as they look kinda like squirrels with their quote-unquote ears and wide tails. A fun behavior we can observe is when something dangerous shows up, they go on alert by propping themselves up on their tails, which is adorable, and finally will run away and burrow if it gets too close. Now let's jump over to the oasis real quick, because we have some fishing to do. Of course, fish also count as endemic life, so I want to document as many of them as possible. Yep, just a normal day of fishing. These are ideal conditions. Aha, we got a wetfish, and this is a classic one that provides us with some scales that we can sharpen our weapons with. I believe these will even do the job faster than your usual whetstone. At one point, I also grabbed this green fish known as a virid bowfin, and this fish didn't seem to give me anything, so I think it was just worth some points. And I would have kept fishing here, but someone wasn't having it. I know of one other fishing spot that we can find in the map, which involves heading into the caves. In this particular underground pool, I grabbed a sushi fish, which is another classic fish that provides an item that should heal HP and possibly cure bleeding. And that is actually all the fish I ended up catching during the beta. Yeah, I am almost certain that there were many more I could have gotten, but I just didn't check the areas often enough to find anything different. While I was in the cave, however, I did find one more neat critter. On the walls, I spotted these little glowing geckos, and I was lucky enough to get the pop-up on camera because their behavior is pretty interesting. These are Smokeshroud Gekkos, and the text states that they actually drop their luminous material as a decoy to make a quick getaway. So they start off glowing, but once we spook them, they actually shoot that glow off as a smokescreen, which is pretty cool looking. Neat little guys. No, come back. Dang it. Well folks, I saw this little guy in this hidden area and I wasn't recording, so I quickly hit the button, but then it started running away and I just missed it. Man, that's annoying. I'm pretty sure that was some rare creature. Who knows if I'll ever see that again. Well, what do we have here? Thanks to my ghillie mantle, you're not gonna run away this time. So if we take a good look at this, it is a sort of crab covered in a metallic material. And on its back, we can see some sort of artifact. You know, that's basically just the Monster Hunter Wilds logo. or at least it has the same theming, with the serpentine dragon and the various ring motifs. Quite interesting to see this up here, as we are actually located in an area pretty close to the top of the giant ring structure. When we scoop this guy up, it is called the Curioshell Crab, and along with it, we are given an ancient wyvern coin. Now these coins aren't actually that special, I think, as they can drop from large monsters too. I think they are the equivalent of the old wyvern teardrops, which are accounts items that are instantly exchanged for points. The description of the Curioshell Crab also name drops another creature known as the Florashell Crab, which is something I don't think we have met yet, so I guess we'll have to keep an eye out for its counterpart. I think this was probably the rarest creature I was able to find, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are even more hiding in the beta. For example, I remember in one of the trailers, some of the small monsters in the Windward Plains had little birds riding on their backs. That kinda reminds me of the downy crakes, which were notably extremely rare. So if you're able to find any additional animals around, feel free to share your discoveries in the comments. But I have to say, we have finally reached the end of all of the wildlife that I was able to observe during the Monster Hunter Wilds beta. Honestly, I think this was quite fun. A little bit of a change of pace from the intense hunting action, and I always love to observe the level of detail put into the creature designs and animations, especially when they are interacting with each other in dynamic ways. So if you folks enjoyed the video, a like is always appreciated, and if you want more of this type of content, please let me know because I could see myself doing more videos like this in the full game. With unlimited time, I might be able to dedicate full videos to observing single species and making sure I don't miss any details. I do of course still hope to do various gameplay guides, however, as I want to put in plenty of time mastering the new combat systems to come up with fun and interesting new ways to play. So now that the beta is past us, there's not much else to do but await the full release, unless they go ahead and sneak a second beta in there, which could very much happen. Until then, I have a couple ideas to work on, so you may be hearing from me in the near future. For now, however, I gotta say, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.